Hello, friends. We need to talk about Sex Pistols. That's a band that has been talked about so much. You're thinking, what in the world can you say about the Sex Pistols that I haven't heard a million times? Probably nothing. But I want to talk about my experience discovering them and the whole thing about punk rock. Talk about punk rock and pop music and all different kinds of music. But punk rock has a name that has bad connotations with some people. I don't know. Punk rock. It's always kind of like this. That was when rock got really angry and ugly, and people were spitting, and the bands did not look attractive, right? They weren't like hot guys on the stage that were trying to be sexy. They were anti all that. They were trying to look unattractive, I guess was the point, or the kind of the style, clothes that were torn up and all that kind of stuff. In a way, it had its own appeal. It kind of spoke to the street, the street level stuff that was going on, and people that were in those years of our lives when we like to go out because our apartments that we live in are so awful that we want to get out of the apartment that we live in. We want to go out and we want to hang out with our friends, but our apartment is so nasty and messy and horrible, and you just want to go out to a club and you can drink and you can hang out with your friends and you can see bands. And that street thing is what was going on. There's like the scene, they call it a music scene, and certain cities would have clubs that everybody would go to, and they would get the best bands to play there. And evidently that happened in London, in the punk rock days. People got so angry with their politics and their economic situation, their job situation. All these things were so lousy that it generated a kind of street level angst. People were like, what are we going to do? And the only option, because they didn't have a whole lot of money, I guess, the only option was to sort of get out there and express this anger and this frustration and this desire to communicate feelings and to communicate the angst and the anger. And, that's a basic overview of where punk rock came from. It came from political situations and people feeling like the world was going wrong, and that rock bands, the music that everybody was into, when you're young, you're into music, so all the music that you could get was this corporate music, this rich kind of, concert tickets were expensive, and the bands were these sort of overblown, gigantic, they used the word dinosaur bands, which meant that they were old and extinct, I guess. And people started rebelling against that corporate thing and going into the idea that you can do it yourself, that DIY thing. You can do a band yourself. You don't need to spend a whole lot of money on guitars and all that kind of stuff. You can do it cheaply. You can dress the way you dress out on the street. You don't have to wear like flashy clothes, and you don't have to have a laser light show on the stage. You can just play on a stage with no lights, So I guess during that time, there were people that were trying to kind of capitalize on it a little bit. People that had clothing stores that were like watching the streets and seeing how the kids are dressing, seeing what the kids are gravitating towards. And they kind of pushed that idea and make the sort of designer version of that. And of course, a lot of people would sort of gravitate around that, around the style aspect of it. So the style of punk rock became a thing that everybody could kind of latch onto, which is ironic because, having this idea being do it yourself, express yourself, this creative self-expression. I'm going to be my own person. I'm not going to try to look like Robert Plant. I'm going to look like me because I don't look like Robert Plant. That turning into a kind of marketed style is a bit ironic because every kid you saw wearing that style. And suddenly I remember thinking, I thought this was supposed to be an individual thing, but everybody started dressing alike, sort of. there was still self-expression within that style. But the Sex Pistols, I think, represented that. Whether it's true or not, you hear John Lydon talking about how, they were not a product. They wrote the songs. I believe that Steve Jones wrote those guitar parts. He didn't have some sort of puppet overlord. I think they were a band. I think they were a real band. They may have met each other around those realms of clothing stores and marketing and product, style and all that kind of thing. But their first album, the design on this thing was, of course, very familiar with that design. I have it on vinyl somewhere, I promise. But that style of no style and just the kind of cut out letters and stuff, that was pretty outrageous at the time. Sex Pistols, they came out of the punk rock scene with an explosion. There was controversy. They said naughty words on TV. Their bass player can't even play. All these different things. And look at that shirt he's wearing. And oh my goodness. And they were considered so heavy and so punk that some people were like, I can't even listen to that. It hurts my head. It hurts my personality. It's going to turn me into a monster or a devil or something. People were scared of the Sex Pistols, and they were scared of punk rock. And I remember there were TV shows that would do episodes where, teenage kids would go punk, and it was like, oh man, so scary to the suburban folks to think that their kid might go punk. There was a notorious episode of Quincy, which is probably on YouTube. I don't know. It was it was about poor Quincy. He's a coroner, I guess, and somebody was killed by punk rock. I guess it was the slam dancing or something, and how it's very deadly and. But the funny thing about it was that it was all about the style, because you could tell that these kids in the show about punk rock, even though it took place in LA and there were plenty of actual punks out there, they got actors, of course, to play the kids, and the kids, playing the kids in the show were not into the punk rock thing, and the hair and makeup and wardrobe were probably not as into it. So they kind of saw some photographs of punk rockers in the newspaper or something, and they tried to do them up like punk rockers. And then the kids, the actors, they did their best to act like punk rock people, and they were like, "Yeah, I don't care," and it just came off as so phony to the people who were really in the scene and really going to see the shows, which is kind of funny because a lot of them were sort of following the rules too. It was around the time when punk rock started getting a lot of rules. But the Sex Pistols, to me, were always a rock band, like a pop band to me. The songs are so catchy, they're fun, they're angry and controversial. There's some on here that are pretty awful, as far as if you listen to the words, they're like, ugh, that's like pretty nasty. And but in general, their hits, their songs, they're like pop songs. They're like heavy pop songs. I did another podcast about the Damned where I talked about how the Damned were considered punk, but they just, to me, did heavy pop songs. I don't know. Fun stuff. The Sex Pistols became then a thing. Their manager sent them to the United States to play a bunch of shows and booked them into the absolute worst clubs, because he wanted to stir up controversy. It seemed to me like he was throwing these poor young guys into a piranha pit by booking them into country clubs, country music clubs, and places where the music that was normally played in this club was like blues or country or rock and roll, like classic rock or something. And so here comes the Sex Pistols. And of course people were going to get in fights with them. Of course people were going to throw things at them. And of course there's going to be chaos. And that is what the manager was trying to do, I think, was trying to create news stories by throwing these unfortunate young men into these situations that were purposefully set up to be confrontational and to create news, which is part of what the Sex Pistols was all about. And they only had that one album, this one, and it's debatable whether this is a Sex Pistols album or not. This is about a film that their manager made called The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, which has footage of them, but it was made after they broke up, after they dissolved, And poor Sid Vicious, people put him up on a pedestal of punk rock, punk rock royalty or whatever. But unfortunately, he was a guy that really wasn't musically inclined. He was a music fan, but he was all about the punk rock style. Sid was kind of made fun of in some ways. I mean, look at this album cover. It's got him in a coffin because by the time this was released, he had died, and so it's kind of awful to think that whoever did this cover put a toy of him in a coffin, like he's dead. It's sad. But I think they were exploiting that about him. They were exploiting the kind of burnout thing, live fast, die young kind of deal with him. And it was kind of depressing to a lot of people who felt like, is a person too. And you see there's a documentary, I think it's in Filth and the Fury, where you see John Lydon talking about Sid, and he's like, yeah, he was my friend. And he gets teary-eyed about it, and he's like, he was a guy, and unfortunately I think he was put into a situation where suddenly he was famous. And he didn't really know what to do with it. He was not really a musician. He was just a guy that hung out at a clothing store and loved Roxy Music and David Bowie. And when punk rock came around, it was another style to kind of latch onto, and he just wasn't prepared for it. So the Sex Pistols, to me, kind of a sad story. But I still love the music. I love the music on the first album. I think those are some great pop songs. And then in the 90s, a buddy of mine said, hey, we're going to see the Sex Pistols. And they played in LA when they did their at the Hollywood Palladium, and it was I saw them on July 6th. No, I saw them on Friday, August 23rd, 1996 at 7:00 p.m. You know how I know that? Because I bought the album from that tour, and I also kept my ticket stub. So check that out, Sex Pistols ticket stub. But of course, Sid was not with them. Glenn Matlock was playing bass, and Glenn Matlock was the original bass player of the Sex Pistols. And so it was, seeing the original Sex Pistols. And I remember John Lydon came out on the stage, and he was like, we're fat, we're 40, and we're back. And it's funny to think of them as at age 40. It's like, wow, it's so young. But, and you see a lot of bands out there, classic bands that are reformed and out there touring. A lot of them, some of them are like 80, and but the Sex Pistols did this tour, and they called it, they named it something that implied they were just doing it for the money, and they were great. And it was a great show. They were all good musicians. Glenn Matlock and Steve Jones, a fantastic band, and Paul Cook and John Lydon, a really fantastic pop band, heavy pop band, punk rock band, if you will. But I really like the Sex Pistols. There's so much to their story. I know there's been fictionalized accounts and lots of documentaries about them, and lots of opinions about whether Sid Vicious is someone to be idolized and respected as a rock star, or is he a sad casualty of fame and a sudden explosion of a certain thing that he was a part of and happened to sort of be at the right place at the right time, or in his case, the wrong place at the wrong time, and got hooked up with people who were not good for him. And, we saw that Gary Oldman movie, Sid and Nancy. Was that how it happened? John Lydon seems to think otherwise. But there does seem to be a lot of discussion about, who he was and what he represented, and he represented that kind of punk rock ideal of, I don't care, I'm against it, whatever it is, I'm against it, and I'm going to drink myself down to the ground and drug myself down to the ground. And in some ways, I think that was something that some people felt was almost like this mythological pop star, this doomed pop star thing, and people kind of, I don't want to say idolized it, but I think they put a little bit too much value into that type of self-destruction. And I saw a lot of people who try to sort of emulate it, which is why I have feelings about it. A lot of my friends kind of seem to want to emulate that idea that this guy, and that feeling of self-destruction, which is not attractive. But anyway, that's what the Sex Pistols are to me. A great pop band. I love the band. I love the music. I love what they did. I love the fact that they still, the survivors are still out there and still, making music in some cases. John Lydon had, of course, Public Image and all that, and he's still doing tours. They've lived lives, and they've gone through some stuff, and they're still out there. And I have a lot of respect for them surviving that. For surviving what Sid sadly did not survive. But yeah, to me it's sad. Sid Vicious is sad. I feel sorry for what he endured and what eventually happened to him. And who knows whether he did a terrible thing and killed someone? Who knows? If it was all drug induced or what? Tons of discussion about that. I don't respect Sid Vicious. I just feel like it was a sad story. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about it. Sex Pistols, listen to the music, enjoy the music, and thanks for listening to me, and I will talk to you again real soon.